excited to get to talk to you. So, welcome to the Selfish Griever podcast. Dr. Lenore Matthew came on last season and, in general, talked about that mediumship is not that uncommon and that it really is pivotal in your grief journey. And just for a brief recap, because anyone who wants to hear that one can go back and listen to that episode. I'll link it in the show notes. But for anyone who hasn't heard it yet, can you give a brief recap on what's like the broad scope of your work?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me back. I'm delighted to be back with you. And of course, given the context of why we're here together. But it is really beautiful to almost check in several months, almost a year later, I want to say. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was some time. So I'm a doctor of social work, and my background is in evidence-based practice and research. My ability of mediumship awoke a few years ago, the night that my late husband passed away unexpectedly. And since that night, I've chills all over. Since that night, my life was turned upside down completely. On one hand, obviously because of the grief and losing my husband at such a young age and losing him by very traumatic means as well. And as we know, grief just obliterates our worlds, at least for the very early years. It's early stages is years, let's be honest. It's been 3.5 years, and I feel like I'm just starting to get my footing. But then also this ability awoke. And so I took my time, but it actually moved quite quickly. I began to develop in mediumship about 8 months after my late husband passed. And from there, it just opened up this world that I'd never even been aware of before. I didn't have that. Now looking back, I understand that I did have experiences as a child, but I didn't have any sort of framework to understand them. And so I wasn't aware of this at all by any means before this opened up. So today what I do, again, I trained in mediumship. I did receive clients for some time, but I always knew that was not meant to be my path. Similar to being as a social worker, my path was never to be a one-on-one therapist, but I knew that whatever was opening up, I didn't have the bigger picture yet. I just had to kind of go with it. And so I did, but about a year ago, actually over a year now, I put it up to my husband on the other side, Bruno, and my spirit team, and I said, I'm ready for what's next. Show me what this is. I love mediumship. It's helped me in so many ways to move through my loss with my husband on the other side, to know that I'm not alone, to have these incredible insights that I never would have gotten without it. But again, I knew that I was ready for a little bit more about what is my unique path going forward in this. And my way of gauging what that would be, I knew as if it felt right in my gut. And so very quickly I received a download. I call them downloads. It's just, when the information just pours in. And I was being led back to research and also back into the world of speaking and education, which is really what my background is as a researcher and a doctor of social work. So today what I do, I conduct original research on mediumistic and psychic awakenings. I conduct research to evaluate how seeing mediums and other kinds of healers helps our mental health, especially after grief and trauma. And then I also do programs. I'm just about to launch a few online programs teaching people how to develop their own skills, their own mediumistic abilities and psychic abilities to connect with their loved ones on the other side and also open up to their soul path.
So it's interesting because I know that it's a common, it's commonly communicated that like everyone has these capabilities. There's maybe people with different aptitudes, which I relate to being like anything, like people who have better aptitudes to math or writing or whatever. It's not that different. So do you feel like that means that basically anybody who has any interest at all in developing their mediumship further, that it's like appropriate for them to pursue that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I liken it to, it's learning another language. We all are born with an innate right and capacity and ability to learn another language. And exactly as you said, someone may have a particular natural talent for speaking multiple languages. That could be, but we all have the ability to learn how to say like hola, right, in a second language, for example, and even more so. And then we all have our own flavors or almost our own accents when we speak the language as well. So one person may be highly clairvoyant, meaning they see and they envisions, they get their messages from spirit. Someone else, like for me, for example, how my most kind of dominant psychic ability is sentience. So I feel so deeply. Physically, I can feel the other side. If someone passed a certain way, I can feel that in my body. And also the emotions that other people carry. And I think we all as sensitive people identify with that, being heavily empathic. But absolutely, we all have this ability. And I've worked with people who've come to me, and most people are kind of, gingerly stepping a toe in and saying, I might maybe have this. If there's a curiosity there, you absolutely do. And again, we all have it. But the curiosity really is kind of the open door to say, I'm ready to begin getting curious at the very least about this. But everybody has had like a gut feeling before, right? Everybody has had some sort of an explanation some sort of a coincidence that we can't explain. We've all experienced signs and synchronicities. Whether or not we observe them, that's a whole nother animal, because we're living our day-to-day life as humans and we're kind of oblivious to the world oftentimes. But the more we tune in and the more we develop our abilities, the more we're likely to pick up what's going on around us, and it just feeds into the power of not only observing more, but then we start to receive more as well.
Mm-hmm. So in your work with surveying other people, do you find that there are people who are experiencing but they're not recognizing because it's not like a neon sign, or it's not like a disincarnate, person who suddenly shows up like in the room with them, talking to them directly? Like, I think people commonly misconstrue that mediumship is always that level, and not that that level doesn't exist, but are you witnessing there's varying levels?
Yes. So I taught my first program a year ago to other people who were interested in opening up to their abilities. And being a researcher and evaluation specialist, which I still am, that is a part of my DNA, it's a part of who I am, I surveyed people beginning and end, so pre and post test or pre and post intervention. And it was an ongoing program. And every single person came in saying, I don't know, or I don't, some people even said, I don't think I'm intuitive. Some people, and intuitive can kind of be used synonymously in what we're talking about here for psychic or sensing something, whatever it may be, a loved one, a guide, whoever it may be, our own soul. And at the end of the program, every single person said, I understand now that I am intuitive. And part of it is learning, I think the biggest part actually is learning to trust ourselves. One, learning to trust ourselves and let our thinking mind turn off. Two, it's learning how to develop, which is really just ongoing practice, ongoing validation that we receive from practice. So either meeting in groups or doing online programs, we start to get confirmation that what we're receiving isn't something that either A, we've made up, or B, is coming from some other place that could be explained by another reason. So absolutely. And again, it's also, I think the third point would be we start to learn our own unique flavor of that language. So we start to feel, and especially if we're very sentient or very psychically empathic, we don't recognize oftentimes that how we exist in the world is particular to us. And so for somebody who's highly sensitive to other people's emotions, it never would occur to us that not every single person lives that way. And when I started to realize in my own development that not everybody sits down in front of someone and immediately can feel their emotions. I immediately know if somebody is sad, and then I start to feel that as my own. And it was also through training that I began to parse apart what are my emotions and what are someone else's. And then as that starts to develop, then I start to realize, okay, when I see flashes of images, that's information, that's a language. When I hear something in the back of my mind and I tune in, okay, that's also information. So we start to kind of piece all the puzzle like snippets together, and it starts to make sense of how we're constantly intuitively connected, but we may not always be aware that we are.
Mm-hmm. And how important do you think is that validation piece that comes into play, even if it's you receiving messages for yourself? Like, I know you've talked about that you got communication from Bruno right away, and that then you were also able to like objectively validate some of the stuff that came through, even though it was, just to you, not you trying to, connect with someone else on their behalf. So how important do you think that is to the process?
I think for me, especially in the beginning, it was massively important on multiple levels. I mean, the first level is when he first crossed over, and I didn't grow up with a spiritual orientation. I didn't grow up with a religion. I'm a very open person, and I've always been curious, but I didn't have a framework. And Bruno and I had never talked about death before he passed, either in the human aspect of what would we do if that happened. I mean, we were in our mid-30s. It never even occurred to me. And so, but then also in a spiritual sense, I had no idea. I never really even thought about it because I didn't have a reason to think about it. I was going through life, career, rents, groceries, whatever we think about in our human lives. And so when he crossed, and I know we talked about it last time, but I would receive information from him in dreams and meditations and visions, and he would direct me towards information that objectively I could verify that helped me understand his passing. And then he started coming to me with messages for other people with information there's no way I would have known. So, for example, he came to me once, this was I can't remember how long, around a year after he had crossed. And he came to me in a meditation, and he just had this download for his dad, and I knew that he wanted me to give this to his dad. And the message was around a Puget car, which I didn't even know what that was. Like, we don't really have those in the States, and they're from another country, and so they don't really have them in that country either, to be honest. So a very specific details about this car, and then very specific details about my father-in-law's father, so Bruno's grandfather, who I never met, and actually I don't even know if Bruno met him in the physical. And then details about the relationship. So I call my father-in-law again. Bruno has been crossed for a year, and by now he's used to it because I'm getting these messages all the time for him, and he picks up the phone, he's like, another one? I'm like, yeah. And I just tell him the details, and very intimate, beautiful details about the relationship between him and his own dad. And he broke down, and he's like, well, that was a car that my dad gave me. How did you know that? I was like, Bruno told me, I don't know. And he didn't even know that when he was in the physical, right? He certainly never told me. But then there were all these details about healing their relationship with Bruno's dad and his dad. So it's like this intergenerational coming together. And that's one way that Bruno continues to reach out and work through me and with me, is he'll give me messages to give to some of his loved ones about different ways to continue healing, especially with people who have crossed to the other side. And with my father-in-law, I'm sure you'd be very fine with me saying this because we've talked about it openly as well. Because again, this is just a testament to how beautiful the continuation of healing is on the other side. But it opened my father-in-law's eyes to, oh my gosh, there's still healing that can be done. And while my own dad has been crossed for many decades, maybe we can, and absolutely we can, still begin to really mend some things that needed to be mended. And so validations like those in the beginning, I mean, they were life-changing for me. One, because it validated, yes, that Bruno is still here and we're still growing together. But it completely shifted my view on what happens after here, and then also how we continue healing. And when we're in grief, the grief perspective is, we get over, quote unquote, which we never do, but we get over, we move forward through the pain of grief. And then we kind of put it to bed at some point and move on with our lives. But having this perspective that healing continues on the other side, and in ways that the cognitive mind could never dream of. Like, I'd never even heard of Bruno's paternal grandfather. We never really talked about him. But then he brought this into my awareness, and it just opened my eyes to, oh my goodness, healing relationships not only continues, but when we lean into it, it brings like this ripple effect, even for people like myself indirectly affected, but it brings this direct effect as well to those who are in the relationship, immense alleviation and clarity, and not having to carry the weight of pain for the rest of your life. And so to work, and goosebumps all over with that, so to work through some of the pain, even after we've crossed over, and work through some of the hardships, and also move into the light with relationships with loved ones on the other side. Like we continue having these relationships even when they're not in the physical world. It's just a matter of tuning in, which takes a lot from our cognitive mind, yes. But it also, it's with practice, it just becomes kind of a way of life.
When you were running your program the first time, did you notice, I guess, different people progressing at different rates in their mediumship?
I don't know. That's a tough one. So I didn't measure objectives like, can you connect? And it wasn't a program like what I went through in mediumship training, which was very rigorous evidential mediumship training, which is, I mean, there would be more, not like we were, tested. Although if I were to ever, and it's not my path, but if a medium were to go forward and be tested to be certified, then there certainly are objective markers like that, benchmarks that you would have to make sure that you meet or surpass. But how I teach and approach continued connection, which is actually the name of the program that I'm about to launch, continued connection with our loved ones, and then connection with our own gifts, our own abilities. I don't look at it as like, can you connect or not? Are you more psychic than mediumistic? Are you more mediumistic than, whatever it may be? I look at it as like, is this unfolding your life in a way that makes you feel more aligned, open, joyful? Are you receiving insights that open your heart? And I was going to say open your mind. Yes, that's a part of it, but it's really opening your heart and bringing some balm to the pain that we feel, especially after loss, but also just bringing in curiosity and joy. And that's what happens when we work in this space. One, because the vibration is so high, and yes, there are absolute, and let's not bypass the difficulty that comes with working spiritually, because like, for example, in my father-in-law's case, I'm sure it was quite difficult to relive some of the difficulties with his own father who'd passed many decades before. And of course, working with Bruno is painful because he's not physically here, and that's a reality. But on the other hand, or kind of aligned with that, or parallel to, we start to see the world and live in the world and live our lives day to day with a different orientation that lets us kind of slow down. It helps me not be in fight or flight so much, and I can move through the ongoing challenges that life will continue to serve us, because it will. That is what human life is, and even if we've gone through something catastrophic, it doesn't preclude us from having other difficulties. On the contrary, we'll continue to have them. That's what human life is. That's this experience. But having a spiritual orientation, one, it helps calm the body. Like my physiological body, my nervous system is just at ease compared to how it was before. And so practices like meditation, practices like breath work, which are some of the things that I do to develop, it helps my body be stable. But then the insights as well help me understand the issues the challenges that I encounter in a totally different way. And so these are kinds of the sort of markers that I was looking at pre and post of the program, of basically, how do you feel? Mm-hmm. How does your sense of self, how do you feel about yourself, your confidence, and learning something new, and then having these new orientations help us feel better about ourselves?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that so common in our society is to judge everything, including like our own experiences, and then discount them. And part of that then comes into this element of pressure that you put on yourself, that like, oh, if I'm gonna, try this, I need to be amazing at it right away, or I need to get all these amazing insights. And sometimes it doesn't work that way, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's definitely harder to work through that if you're pressuring yourself right from the beginning to achieve bigger heights. So that's why I was curious, so that sounds amazing, the way that you approach your program, that it's not about focusing on, I guess, necessarily the individual experiences you're having psychically or mediumship wise, but your overall wellness and way you're able to just connect and identify with being part of a larger universe is what it really sounds like you're talking about.
Absolutely. Oh, just goosebumps all over. That strong yes and strong co-sign to that. Absolutely. It's like, how do we feel? And especially after living something like the loss of a partner or a child, it's like, if something makes me feel good, like, absolutely I'm going to explore it. How could I not? Because we felt so terrible for so long and so deeply.
Is that what pushed you to, or gave you like the impetus to want to join an evidential mediumship training, which, like you said, is like a more rigorous and I guess specific type of work that you're doing? I don't know that like everybody is ready for that kind of work. What exactly was it that like prompted you that you wanted to go there?
So I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know this landscape. I still was asking myself questions like, am I quote unquote crazy? Which is not a word I would ever, especially as a social worker, never a word that I would use, except unfortunately I was using it to myself, which is indicative, I guess, of how society looks at these things, how I looked at it, how I internalized it, at least initially. But I had no idea what to do. I had no idea where to find, like, I didn't know that you develop and you get a teacher and a mentor, and it just sounded all to me very foreign and a little guru-esque, and I was like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this, because I was so vulnerable and so skeptical, even though I was having these experiences and documenting them and having them almost every day. But what I did was I put it up to Bruno and to Spirit, which is wild because on one hand I'm sitting here like, I don't believe this is crazy. And then on the other hand, I'm saying that to my husband who's on the other side, and I know that he's with me. And I'm like, okay, like this is just, again, my reality was just so all over the place. But I leaned into it and I asked him to guide me. And I think knowing me and knowing how sensitive and vulnerable I was in the very beginning, but also how I'm not so like left brain that I don't see, again, I'm very empathic and I'm a social worker, we're very sensitive in general, but I think Bruno knows, of course he does, my style, in that I wouldn't have been comfortable, I would have left, I think, if it had been a training program that was like very spiritual, using terminology that was, to me, out of my realm of what I'm comfortable immersing myself in. And so I think he led me to a path down a path and to a particular type of training that he knew that I would be comfortable with. And it wasn't just him, I'm sure it was like spirit source in general, my own soul, it may have even been predetermined. But again, part of it too, and just it was so intertwined in my own development, was wanting that confirmation that what I was experiencing with my husband on the other side was valid. And to that end, that means that he's still here. And that was so interwoven in my grief process, and just to have those constant reminders. But my brain works in like outline format, so I liked being trained in a way so, I knew now I have my own twist and take on mediumship, but in the beginning it was like, these are, the things that we understand about a person when they cross over. We focus on, feel into their personality. What is their character like? Have them give you a memory. Have a conversation with them. If they show you specific objects, things like that, have them put something in your hand that the person that you're sitting with would recognize. And sometimes those tactics work. Sometimes the spirit on the other side is like, no, I'm going to do it my way, and that's fine. But for me, I needed something, and still do. Like when I see mediums, I only see evidential mediums, and I see mediums still now, because for me, I do want that solid kind of objective piece, plus then the more soulful spiritual side as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm losing my train of thought. Shoot, I was going to ask you something about that. When the program you ended up going with, I'm just curious if, I guess I feel like sometimes, especially if you're trying to lean into intuition and spirituality and stuff, that you can fall into this trap of thinking that like everything you're guided to is the thing that's absolutely meant for you, and you're supposed to do it and follow it through to the end. And then sometimes you start something or you come across someone and then you're like, oh, actually, like now that I'm into it a little bit, that's not hitting quite right. And initially, I think it used to make me think like I judged it wrong. I like didn't, I like let myself get overly excited or whatever, and that wasn't actually my intuition. Now I look at it for myself personally from the perspective of, no, this was an experience intended to happen as well, right? Like it's a learning process, and you learn by sometimes having the missteps that give you the perspective. But I'm just curious how that was for you, because I know from personally like looking into mediumship further that it feels like to me there can be kind of a vast array of training styles of, evidential versus I guess not, or more intuitive, type. And so it's, especially to somebody who's new to it, it's, to me, it was even kind of surprising how varied all of it could be, because I think the outside, general public it's just medium, and everybody falls under that umbrella. So what was that like for you?
So I agree with you in that in the beginning, and I still am. Sometimes I kind of cling to signs like, oh, that has to be it. Like it makes sense. But I think that even if a certain program isn't, you don't complete it, or you decide it's not for you, or whatever it is, there's still a reason that for whatever it is that you went there, right? So say you go to a program and it just completely first day you're like, this is not for me. It served a purpose in that now you're aware of that, and it's like, in my gut, I know that this is for me, this isn't for me, etc. And I never would have known, or you never would have known unless you tried it out. So to that end, I think that there always is a purpose. I truly believe now everything happens for a reason. I believe that, I know that, I hold that close. Is this going to be in the background?
I don't know. We'll just keep going, and if it ends up being that it's too loud, because they just started making noise right now. I didn't hear them really before, so.
They didn't tell me that they were doing this either. Usually they'll
How
put a notice
random.
on my door.
So random. Are they washing the windows? Or are they doing work on the building?
They're doing work on the building. There must have been something that happened.
Huh.
Okay, we'll keep going.
We'll be okay. Yeah. Which actually makes me think about when you talked earlier about just overall your nervous system feeling calmer. I feel that too, because I resonate with that, and I feel like that falls in line with what you're talking about right now, that when you have this perspective of things are happening in your life for a reason, even the things that we would have normally categorized as failures or, downfalls in life, are actually all serving a purpose, or all like steps on the journey. And so it releases, and I think the whole broad spectrum of your life, that feeling of pressure to not make a mistake, to not always know what you're doing and know what your plan is and how you're going to execute XYZ. And that's really been a big piece. It's taken time to get there, but it's a big piece. So yes, that totally makes sense what you're saying about that. Even if find yourself somewhere that you're like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. So I'm sorry, continue.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think that information too helps us understand looking back as well. So say, for example, this is hypothetical, but I go to a program, and actually, no, I will use an example that is from real life. So I went to a very rigorous program, an advanced mediumship program, and I was telling myself, and this was after having developed for a couple of years, and I told myself, this was definitely egoic brain, I understood afterwards, but I was like, no, I need to get back and I need to be doing more development, if anything, just for myself. And I signed up and I paid the money, and my gut was like, no, this doesn't feel good, but my brain is like, you have to keep developing, you have to keep doing better, right? So that's the conditioning side, that's our society at play and internalized. And right before the program starts, I emailed and I was like, I'm sure this would be a great program, but it's not for me. And they're like, well, you don't get your money back. I was like, yeah, I figured. But what that did, I didn't even get there to figure out how it was going to be. And I think looking back, I knew some people in the program, and it was like very hardcore, like learning to do very hardcore demonstrations, that kind of thing, which is not where I am, at least right now in my journey. And that information, it just confirmed to me, it was another piece of information of trust your gut, Lenore. Trust your gut. And so even that was just another life lesson of, okay, so a couple $100 down, down the tube, not great, but I'll get over that. But it was more that lesson of, really, I paid a couple $100 to have this reaffirmation of trust your intuition, trust your gut. And so again, everything happens for a reason, and now I really do. So I do a lot of like muscle testing. I call it gut testing. And for me, I don't make decisions very quickly. And if I ever make a rash decision, and this is really post Bruno's loss, I used to be quite rash, but now I don't rush into decisions. And if I do, it's usually one that I regret, or one that I feel like I have to make right then, right? But I'll let myself and let the energy just kind of dissipate and let it settle. And then I listen to my gut, and is it a yes or is it a no? And if it's I don't know, I've learned that for me that's a no. Or it's a not right now. It's a not yet. It's a not at this point. But learning, like how, for me, how my intuition sits in my body has been so important. And a big part of that is like letting the initial like adrenaline settle. And it might take me a couple days to make a decision now, and the world's not going to end if that's the case. Like everyone will be fine. But yeah, again, it's all information. And ultimately, I look at it as it's all information that's going back to helping us live our most authentic and joyful selves.
Yeah, I think for me, and I even noticed it when I looked back over my life, like I think the best example is I can go into a clothing store and see something that's like right on the first rack by the door, and I love it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. But I was like raised, and nothing wrong with this, but just with the idea of like, okay, well, keep that in mind and like weigh out your options, check out everything else, make sure that's really what you want before you just impulsively choose it. But like 95% of the time, I would spend an hour walking around the store and I end up right back at the first rack, that very first thing I liked when I walked in the door. And so now I've kind of recognized, because even in life decisions, I will like, ruminate and like mull it over for days and days and days, even though that initial reaction was like, yes, this is a good idea. And 95% of the time I end up back right where I started, being like, yep, this is still something I want to do. Now, I will say that a skill set I've had to learn is not what I would call like rewriting history, right? When you make that choice and then you go into it and then it turns out it was something that was just a learning experience for you to learn, it wasn't what you needed to do. Not letting my ego tell me, oh, well, you didn't really listen to your intuition the first time. That was you making something else up. That was you letting your ego run the show. And trusting that, like, no, in that moment, I was intentional and listened to myself. And, and it's okay that it doesn't mean everything turns out for the best just because your intuition told you that's what you were supposed to do. And I think one time I went to like an intuition development like workshop thing, and this woman asked, well, what about when your intuition's wrong? She was asking the instructor. And I remember thinking, and I think I even shared with the group, like, in my opinion, my intuition's never wrong. My intuition maybe didn't end up taking me somewhere that my ego told me I was going to end up. But that doesn't have any impact as to whether or not my intuition was wrong. That's me prejudging based on things I don't know. So I think that that's really, it's been important for me, at least on my journey with developing intuition and just trusting. And I think that's part of what makes intuition almost kind of hard to realize that you're doing it, because it really just, to me, it's not like I don't get like voices in my head that sound, like Great Aunt Carol or something telling me what to do. It's just this feeling, and I've learned to trust it, and that's following the intuition. But it can be, it can become, like you said, second nature, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not noticing anymore that you're really doing it as much. It's just a way of life.
I love that. That is so beautiful. And as you're saying this, there's something that comes to mind of what you said to your group of my intuition is never wrong. It's my brain sometimes that is telling me that the story needs to go XYZ way. It feels like a big component, an important component of that is unattachment or detachment. Mm-hmm. And we learn this in grief, whether we want to or not. It's like we're forced to surrender. Can you hear that?
I can. It's okay. We're just going to keep rolling with it.
Okay.
It's fine. I mean, it's just the universe having fun with us. Like, it's fine. We're going to be fine.
True. Yes, that's so true. But it's a detachment is what I'm hearing you say, which is so important, or the unattachment from outcomes, or the unattachment of what we think the narrative is supposed to be. And we're kind of, especially in our society, we live on this reward system of like, we're told to attain certain objectives and meet certain goals and have a life that looks a certain way. And in grief and the loss of someone who is so a part of you, that turns that entire narrative upside down. I mean, I know that we both had very different views of what life would be like. Mm-hmm. And when that was taken away from us, it's almost like I even ask myself sometimes, I'm like, was that taken away from me, or is it just a different way that the story is playing out? And of course, my human side is like, no, my husband was taken from me. That's not okay. That's not fair. And it's taken me a long time to move out of a space. And sometimes, let's be honest, there are still days when I miss him. Of course I do. but it's also, it's like a surrendering to, there's a bigger story, there are deeper reasons, there are greater kind of joys even and gifts to be experienced, but it's going to look very different than anything that I've been conditioned or brought up with to believe could be possible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that concept bleeds over into other areas of your life when you are experiencing it so strongly in one specific area in a way that's like impacted your everything. And so you can't help but, you know, see the way that that plays out in maybe more menial ways that before would have been such big deals. I mean, to me, for me, grief has been a process of surrender and surrendering, the illusion that I had complete control over, everything in life, and the illusion that I know what's best, for me, that my master plan is the only plan, and the illusion that I don't know that bad things won't happen, but that they're not. I don't know that they're not. They're devastating, obviously, and but I realize now, like, I have the capability to overcome probably anything that comes my way now at this point after what I've been through. So that doesn't mean that I naively believe that like the worst things ever happened to me, so bad things can't possibly keep happening, like the universe is going to cut me a break from now on. I know that's not true, but I can trust that I'm capable and that I will keep learning, and I believe that like my soul chose for it to be this way. So it picked things and co-created this life that it believed, wholeheartedly I was capable of moving through and learning from and growing. And yes, there are times that I think like, you really loaded your plate up there, didn't you, Whitney? Like you couldn't have taken it a little easier. But yeah, it's definitely something that colors everything.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And having that perspective of, well, there's kind of two things that I've started to think about since Bruno passed is one, and I do believe, and I think we both believe that to some extent we agreed to what would happen. We had some sort of a plan. We had no idea how exactly it would play out. There were probably infinite different possibilities. But I've also started to wonder, like, to what extent the plan up on the other side is there are some sort of derivatives that also play out as well that affect us. Like, maybe there are other chance encounters or coincidences, but again, it's just kind of rolling with what may be. And again, that just detachment and acceptance and trust that this confined life is not all that there is. And okay, like, give it to me. I'm here for it in this life, and what may come. I really hope that I do myself and my soul justice by really living a life that is meaningful and full and complex and joyful, but also leaning into the moments that aren't so joyful, because I know that there's always another side to those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was thinking about, since you have experience not only as the griever getting like the comfort of the messages coming through, but you also have experience as the medium bringing messages through for other people who are grieving. Can you explain or describe what that's like for you when you're able to connect with somebody else's loved one and bring through a message for them? Maybe another example, obviously you did that for your father-in-law, but what does it feel like when it's like for a stranger?
Oh, it's wild. It really does feel like wearing two hats. And Spirit knows to use, obviously, my lived experience as a griever, but also my experience as a social worker. Like, they will tap into all of my skills. There will be moments when I was doing one-on-one readings. Again, I don't really do them now. When I do them now, it's more when it comes up with people that I love. It's in my program. Sometimes it'll come up. I just co-led a retreat, and we did readings then. And I've had to be, and also in my research as well, when the data that I was collecting, the interviews, loved ones came in, and then we honored that. It was part of the interviews, and it was wild, and it was not your typical research. But I've had to be very conscious of my boundaries, being a medium, and again, we all are, but being now a trained medium, and also someone who's still in very early grief. And when I was practicing as a medium, when I was giving readings, it was a year, 2 years, 2.5 years in, it was very early. And being so sentient, meaning I pick up people's emotions. So I was picking up the griever that I was working with, but also spirits on the other side. And I was just bombarded with emotions, and some of them were so familiar to me, I could not differentiate what was mine and someone else's. So I just say that kind of as a disclaimer. I wouldn't say that that's the case. I know other mediums whose abilities opened up after loss, and their path is very much to be a medium and one-on-one reader. And it played out differently for them, and we all will have our own path. But in terms of giving the messages, I mean, that's the most beautiful part. It's interesting, though, being a medium, because you are in a bit of a trance state. Like, probably many of us listening to this episode have gone into a deep meditative state, and we're floating, we're transcending, we're in kind of another space. We meet our loved ones on the other side. And being an evidential medium, we're not so entranced that we're out of the space, but I very much feel like I'm sharing my body, I'm sharing my consciousness with someone else. And so it's a trilateral conversation, me, the sitter, so the person who's receiving the reading, and then the spirit on the other side. And I think some of the hardest readings as a medium are when, and I'm conscious of this because I've been there as a griever, but it's when the spirit person is saying something and the sitter isn't ready to hear it or doesn't want to hear it. And that's how spirit uses me when I was doing readings, and still when I do them. They use me as a medium, knowing, like, what can someone who's in very acute grief, like, how does this need to be said in a way that doesn't re-traumatize someone? But even so, I mean, some people just don't want to hear that their person has passed away. And some people, or at least on the other side, I'm trying to think of some messages. I'll say, so my husband passed by ending his life. He died by suicide. And suicide, obviously I was getting a lot of people who would come to me who were survivors of suicide loss. And suicide is so complex. There are infinite reasons that someone would terminate their own life in that way. And as a reader, so as a medium, it opened my eyes to the complexity of suicide loss. So in my case, Bruno had gone through a horrific trauma as a child, and it was complex and it was compounded, and he never sought help for it. As a medium, I've had people who come in. So someone came in, for example, when I say someone is a spirit, he ended his life by suicide as a conscious decision after, in his elder years, after he found out that he had a terminal illness and he didn't want to live through the illness. And his adult child came to me for the reading. I didn't know anything about them. And I gave her this information, and she's like, this is what I thought it was. And she's like, he wasn't suicidal his whole life, and he didn't have mental health concerns. And I said, I'm not getting that at all. And he walked me very clearly through the illness as it affected his body. And for her, that gave massive validation, because that's what she had thought, but nobody believed her, or that's what she had felt. Mm-hmm. Then there are some suicide losses that are very difficult, and this is hard for me as a human to understand, but I just have to relay it as best as I can, in that the soul that comes, or the spirit that comes, feels like, and they let me feel how it felt to be them, that they were literally just too big for their bodies and for this human life. And that's so difficult to tell someone and to hear. And I know this is being a suicide loss survivor, because we want to know as a human being, give me like the tangible reason. And when we have a soul coming through just saying, like, this life was too small for, like, the body was too small for how big my soul is, and on the other side I can just expand out. Like, they literally would, like, make my body feel like I'm being stretched and I'm so big on the other side. That's really difficult. There was one reading that I did, and again, being an evidential medium, this is my ego. I want those evidential pieces. I want the objective stuff. And this, I'm thinking of one particular reading that was very soulful. And the gentleman who came through, he was one of the spirits who was saying he was just so big for his body here. And then he gave me, and so I could tell that the sitter just wanted more objective information. But as a medium, you can't, I mean, you don't make it up, you can't make it up. And as a sitter, you can feel if it's not genuine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so at the very end of the reading, he, the gentleman on the other side, he gave me an image of a sailboat, a very particular sailboat, and on a body of water. And then he made me feel like it was tangible. So I was like, it's tangible in that I can like hold it in my hand. So it's a postcard or a photograph, something like that. And I gave it to the sitter, and she's like, okay, well, I don't have a sailboat and I don't really live by water, but okay, thank you so much. And, you know, it was a beautiful reading. It was very soulful. I could tell that she wanted more evidence and around his passing, but that's what Spirit gave, and that's what Spirit gave. So she messaged me less than an hour later. And as soon as we got off the call, a friend of hers had sent her a message, and it was a picture of a sailboat, and had said, I don't know why, but I feel the need to send you this picture. And so she messaged me that, and I started crying. I was emotional. So it was like, that was a tangible, objective validation for a very soulful, sometimes beyond the grasp of our human ego, want, mind, hopes, explanations, all of that. And so being a medium, then, it's this dance between, especially being a medium and a griever and someone who's survived very traumatic loss, it's a dance because I know, having been in their seat, what they want to hear. Like, give me the information so that I can fix this, really, is how I would feel. And then Spirit is like, hold up, we've got a whole different agenda. And sometimes it's in line with what you want. Sometimes we know that we've got to tell you something else. And then as the medium, you have to translate that language. And that language can be through images, but it can also be through very complex emotions or very complex physical feelings, like I feel like my spirit is too big in my body. So to translate that is the challenge, while also then being a medium in grief, while also then navigating your own stuff and making sure that you're doing your own work and not letting that influence the objectivity and also the soulfulness of your reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's so intricate. And I mean, like, so many aspects of, I think, the grief journey, and when it involves spirituality especially, there's all these elements that are really like beyond our cognitive capabilities. But I one time had an experience, and it was wholly unexpected. It was at a conference, and he was leading us in a meditation, and we were partnered up, and it was just supposed to be about psychic like readings and picking up energy off a personal item. But I was partnered with this young woman, and her grandfather came through to me, and it was all clairvoyant. I saw him, and then like all the messages, well, I also heard him, but most of like the messages he came through that were more evidential were images to me, which is interesting because I'm not trained, so I don't already have like when you read about mediums, they talk about, for those listening who don't know, that you have kind of like a symbol dictionary, so to speak, or your own lexicon that you've developed that they can reference to communicate specific messages because you have like a standardization. I don't have any of that because I'm not a trained medium and I was not expecting this experience at all. But so that is one piece of it. Trying, when you think about spirit connecting with a medium who has the capacity to appropriately bring across the message that they're trying, so that's like one piece of it. But then also, I think in my mind, it seems like, especially when you start diving into it, like, oh, there's so many mediums, and it feels like it would be so simple for like a soul on the other side to find a medium to connect with, to get to, to the loved one. But I think in reality, it's much more complicated than that, because there's all these elements that have to come together. And the part that I wasn't fully understanding in the midst of the reading, but I picked up on later as I reflected back, was that as the longer that I was connected with him, which I think it was like 5 minutes, it wasn't, a huge thing, but he was getting the soul on the other side, the grandfather, was getting more and more excited. Like, I could tell he was like, it was, at first he was just like smiling and friendly, but then it was like his energy, he was just getting so hyped about this opportunity to connect with his granddaughter. And it made me think about, really the like randomness of that opportunity coming up. She wasn't seeking a medium. I wasn't, offering myself as a medium. This opportunity just came up and he got that chance to connect. And it makes me think about, you hear people talk about like they want to get to speak to you or they want to get to speak to their loved ones. But when I got to really witness it and see it in a way that was so, I guess, such a human display of that excitement. It wasn't like a subtle ethereal thing. It wasn't like, oh, his aura got brighter. It was literally like watching him like bounce up and down on his heels like a child getting a piece of candy or something. Like he was so excited. And yeah, and it was this amazing feeling. I mean, she started crying when I was telling her what was coming through. And meanwhile, again, because I'm not trained, I was telling myself, like, when you're imagining all of this, like, of course you're, thinking of a grandfather and he looks like a standard, little old grandfather. Like I described what he wore and everything. But for her, it was so validating and real that she was like moved to tears, and some messages that I didn't understand, again, because I didn't have the reference point. But when I described to her what I saw, it brought through some information that was really, it was more than just like warm and fuzzies. It was really meaningful to her. And it was the craziest thing. And yet, even after that experience now, I sit back and think like, I don't know that I'm supposed to be a medium. Like, I don't know that I'm supposed to do, one-on-one readings, or when I've signed up for trainings and I look around and think like, I don't know, I don't psychically intuit, things about other people. Like I'm not, it feels, even though I experienced it, it feels like it was a fluke. And so, I guess that's what I think about when I think about other people out there experiencing things like that, and maybe considering like, is this really a big deal, or is this happening to everybody, or am I supposed to do something with this now? or was it just like a great one-time experience that I got to be a part of and it gave me a new perspective? But it is, I think, for anybody who's going to be a sitter, just in general, having the awareness, because I don't think, especially if you're not trained in it or you're not really thinking about it that far out, having the awareness of like how many different things came together for you to be in that moment in front of that medium who's then connecting to your loved one. I mean, that alone is no small feat. So even if you didn't necessarily get the messages that your ego told you needed to hear, or that you desperately wanted to hear, there is still something miraculous happening, in that experience that is so beautiful.
Yeah. Oh my God, that is so eloquently and beautifully said. And my heart is just like, yes, yes. No, I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're so right, Whitney. It's like the context, the multiple moving parts that had to come together in order for that to happen. And who knows, maybe on the spirit side, they had a hand in making sure that the two of you were paired together. I'm sure that was a part of it, or they already had foresight that it would happen. And we'll only understand that fully when we're where they are, completely on the other side. There were a couple things that you said that I wanted to comment on, if that's okay. So one was it a fluke, right? Was that one experience just a one-time thing? And I would say, well, absolutely not. And I'll tell you what one of my early mentors told me was, if you've done it once, you can do it again. And with development and training, we learn how to kind of turn on the switch. But I mean, and to that end, I had a reading last week with one of my very early teachers who's been doing mediumship for decades. And she's like, still, every time you sit down as a medium, you still wonder if it's going to turn on or not. And it does every time. But again, that's the human side of like, how could this be? Like, how is this possible? So there's that aspect of the human side. I don't know that it ever goes away. And then there's something else. Like, I think back to my very early experiences, which was, again, it was around almost a year, maybe 8-10 months when I first started just exploring intuitive development, and then mediumship came a couple of months after I started opening up to this. And I look back and I almost kind of long for my very first experiences, because I didn't have the training that kind of shaded it. And so they were very pure experiences. I just kind of let them happen. I wasn't trying to understand them. Like, I didn't know what clairvoyance versus, clairsentience was. I didn't have that framework. And while that absolutely helps me now to understand myself, and I'm so grateful for the training that I've had, there's something very kind of, I don't know, honest and untouched about just connecting to spirit and letting it go without being like, okay, my training said that this is the way that, that it should proceed. And then the other point that I think is so beautiful is like, so a bone that I have to pick with mediumship training is it's very narrow. And the training that's out there for mediumship specifically is really formatted in a way that you learn how to do one-on-one readings and you learn how to do big platform demonstrations, and that's kind of it. But for those of us, and this has come up in my research, and this is really the impetus for some of the programs that I'm putting out, there's not a lot out there for those of us who are just curious about mediumship. Yes, there's things out there about like manifesting and intuition. But if you're just curious about mediumship, there's not really much out there. And there's really not much out there for those of us who are opening up to these abilities after the loss of a loved one. And in mediumship development, for those who are opening up to our abilities by way of loss, we have a completely different frame of reference. We have completely different motivations. We may not ever want to sit with somebody. And also, not everybody should be. I mean, not everyone who, learns, who goes to culinary school is supposed to be a personal chef. There are multiple things that you can do with those skills. And part of it might be just for you or for you and your family. So I feel that the more that we open up to just getting curious about our abilities, and I say we like as the collective, we'll start to see, I believe, ways in which this is normalized and plays out in really incredible ways day to day, that we start to use our psychic senses, our mediumship, our intuition, in really beautiful ways across society that is the own flavor that each of us have. So maybe for you, it's part of the work that you do as a podcaster and as an advocate and as a grief advocate. And it's like, I can speak to this, and this is why that opened up. Maybe for me it was the research and the research side and the education side, who knows. I work with a writing coach, for example, who's a psychic, and she taps in and uses her intuition in helping me understand like my writing, and that's what she does with her clients. And so, and people who do like
that's incredible.
Yeah, right? I mean, there are ways that we channel, like composers do that in their writing of music. And so there are really beautiful, unique ways, I think, that we can all tap into our gifts. And we already are doing so probably without even being conscious of it. But I think the more that we're encouraged as a society to start developing what is innately, intuitively ours, then it starts to come out. And then when it comes out, then we're all really living our paths and our soul purposes.
Yeah, and I think it's beautiful that you're creating a container, because I agree that there's not a whole lot of outlets for somebody who's just curious to learn more for their own use, their own understanding even, before there is no like in between step, right? You're either like, you're total novice and you've had a couple experiences personally that you recognize were something, and then you're taking like a full-blown training, at a level that's like intended for people who are going to offer it professionally. And on the one hand, like, I do 100% appreciate those programs exist, as I'm sure you do too, because being a medium who has done one-on-one sessions, you fully understand and appreciate like the level of integrity, of ethics, of even standardization to some extent that is necessary to give credence to what is a very real profession. But yeah, kind of going back to your example before about languages, like not everyone who learns how to speak a second language is meant to be a translator, right? Like some people just do it because they want to be able to like travel in that country and check around and see what's up. So I totally agree with that. And it's beautiful to be offering that, because it is hard, the gap. I feel like right now the only service right now is a book, right? That's like a low cost investment that you can read, but it's still kind of very isolating. And not that people who are doing a different program aren't going to be self-motivated, but I think it's a different level of self-motivation when you're not getting any feedback. You're just, one-way information receiving. But I also think that it speaks to the progression of like consciousness on a whole in the whole world, that there are these very intense professional level programs that are fully developed out and have been around for some of them for decades, because that is like what was out there, those people on the fringes basically that were taking and were interested in it for that specific purpose. But now, as our consciousness level is getting raised and more people are wanting to just know for their own information, I mean, I think that's just beautiful that we're now in a place that there is a demand for a program like yours. And I think it's just going to keep growing, just keep moving more and more. And and how incredible will that be someday when, maybe in a couple decades from now, but when it's almost like commonplace to be like, oh yeah, I got a message from my grandmother last night and it was beautiful. And people just talk about it openly, and it's not this weird closeted, experience that you're having. So, yeah.
I agree. I do think we're moving there. It's almost like I'm being a mental health professional and a social worker. It's like where we were even 10 years ago talking about therapy. It was still hush hush. I mean, still to some extent it is a bit taboo, but much less, especially in post-pandemic worlds. But we talk about it. We talk about things like trauma, and social media has also helped with that. I think our generation has helped with that. We're very vocal about it. We're reducing stigma and shame around the issues that we're talking about. I mean, even me vocally saying my husband died by suicide, I mean, it's still not okay in some circles to say, but it definitely wasn't okay 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And then to say, as a mental health professional, I've also gone to counseling. Like, of course I have. A medical doctor goes to a medical doctor, a dentist goes to a dentist. Like, of course we do. But to talk about these things in a way that it's almost like as another human being, it's like, oh, wow, that's okay. Okay. Maybe that works for me too. I totally agree with you that in a spiritual sense, and talking to our loved ones and communicating with our loved ones and having this other orientation about life in the world and being and consciousness, 100% is going to be different in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Yeah, we'll be looking back at this conversation being like, oh, we were so sweet. And now everybody's talking to like Aunt Carol, like you said before.
Yeah.
Or, your child, my husband, and we'll be looking back on us like we're really glad that we leaned into that because it changed our lives for the better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and help so many others that, we're looking for that too. Yeah. All right, Lenore, well, last thing I want to ask you before I let you go is if there's somebody listening who is now, as they're hearing us, saying like, now that they're talking about this, like I'm recognizing there are times I've like gotten messages or whatever, and they're like very new, interested in what would be the first thing that they should like look into next.
Oh, that is such a good question. I think the first thing depends on who you are, right? So is it going to be starting to like for me, the first thing that I did was document everything. And I created a system right off the bat for me that right out the gate of like and again, this is very early grief. So I made it systematized that I could just use as a template. I made a matrix of like date of what happened, objectively what happened, subjectively, like for example, what emotions did I feel, who was with me, what happened at the time. And that was for me just to have some sort of solid footing underneath me to know that A, I wasn't imagining it, and B, if I see it on paper, like, okay, I can't just, poo-poo it away. In the moment, I documented what it was. It may be your first thing is journaling. It may be your first thing is leaning into meditation. It may be your first thing already is starting to look at what development opportunities are out there. And so I think then kind of looking at this in an umbrella kind of perspective, zooming out a little bit, I think the first thing to do is to take a deep breath, close your eyes if that's comfortable, and tell yourself, I believe you. And tell your loved one, okay, I'm trying to get my head around this, but I believe you, and I know it's you. And even kind of shifting the narrative that we have with ourselves of, I'm crazy, this is crazy, it's just grief, I'm imagining it, how could this be, like I'm nuts, there's something really wrong with me, to shifting it and saying, no, this is real, I know it's real because I'm experiencing it. That kind of just shifts the energy around the experience. I would say something tangible, I know that's a little bit kind of out there, but I do believe in I do believe in the stories and the words that we use to talk to ourselves with. They really do shape how we feel about ourselves and our experiences. So I do think that that's important. And then I would say, honestly, just get curious without any objective in mind. You don't have to put this into a professional capacity. You don't have to understand it fully. You don't have to be, the best medium that there is. If you are, when it unfolds, perfect, and whatever best medium means, who knows? On the other side, I'm sure it means something very different than what we would say in, U.S. American culture. But I would say get curious about it. I think there's a lot of hesitancy because, again, this world is it's sensationalized. What we see in Hollywood, I have such a beef with how Hollywood portrays mediumship. It's not a joke, but it's also not terrifying and scary in a horror show, which is like every show that's out there is so dark and gruesome. I experience light, and love every time I tap in. I've never experienced anything of what we see, in the movies in terms of being terrifying by any means. And so I'd say get curious in terms of leaning into development, if that feels right for you, and again, development that just feels right about getting in touch with yourself and your intuitive self. It could be books, it could be guided meditations, it could be meditative music, it could be somatic healing, but any kind of practice. And on my website, on my resources page, I list tons of places where I've studied mediumship and intuitive work, different kinds of like body up, somatic healing, which again helps with the nervous system. That also helps open your spiritual side as well. So just kind of getting curious about what is out there and finding what feels comfortable in your body. But I think just kind of like taking a step and saying, okay, this is a whole new way of being, but I'm open to it, and then asking your loved one on the other side to guide you, and they will.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Like starting with just yourself and building up that trust and leaning into that guidance that you're getting, and then follow that wherever that takes you, even if it feels crazy. I mean, the word we're not supposed to use, but sometimes that's really the most apt description of like, this is so out of the norm for me. I would never have done this, in a million years before. And that's okay. It is totally okay. So thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing everything. I will make sure to link your website. I'm certain that your website is going to have the information about your programs when they start, right? Okay, yes, so people will be able to find information there about that, which I'm sure is just going to be so amazing. And I'm so excited for you and everything that you're going to be doing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back, and thank you for all of the work that you do and all the messages you put out. You are such a love, such a light.